Chapter 21 of The Book of This and That on Disasters. It is a remarkable thing that human beings have never yet got reconciled to disaster. Each new disaster, like the ship on fire, the burning mine, and the wrecked train, inspire us with a new horror, as though it were something without precedent. Occasionally, in the history of the world, horror has been heaped on horror till people become indifferent. During the Reign of Terror, for instance, the tragic death of a man or woman became so everyday an affair that before long it was regarded with almost as little emotion as a stumble on the stairs. Luckily, the periods are rare in which this terrible indifference is possible to us. It is only by keeping our sense of disaster sharp and burnished that we shall ever succeed in stirring ourselves into action against it. On the other hand, it is amazing for how brief a period the impulse to action in most of us lasts. On the morrow of a great preventable disaster, it is as if the whole human race stood up with bared heads and swore in the presence of Heaven that this abominable thing should never be allowed to occur again. But alas, a full meal and a bottle of wine do wonders in restoring the rosy view of life. Our tears, which at first seem to flow from the depths of our hearts, soon give place to commonplaces of the lips and to sighs that actually increase our sense of comfort rather than otherwise. We who but yesterday realized that trusting to luck was a crime far deadlier in its effects than a mere passionate murder will to-morrow accommodate ourselves once more to the accidental medley of life which at least justified itself in letting so many of our fathers and grandfathers die in their beds. This accommodation of ourselves to life, it is curious to reflect, is just the consenting to drift without a star, which is condemned by all the religions. Life is conceived in the religions as a vigilance. If we are not vigilant, we are damned. It is the same in politics, where we all quote Burke's sentence about eternal vigilance being the price of liberty. But religion and politics do not long survive the dessert. We are as much in love with drowsiness as the lotus eaters, and, at a seemingly safe distance, we are as careless of the ruin of the skies as Horace's just man. Preachers may tell us once a week that we are sentinels sleeping at our posts, and, if they say it eloquently enough, we may possibly raise their salaries. But we have got used to sleeping at our posts, and what we have got used to, we feel in our bones, cannot be regarded as a very serious sin. Once, in the fine wakefulness of our youth, we summoned the world out of its sleep, but our voices sounded so thin and lonely in the sleep-laden air that we felt rather ashamed of ourselves, and we soon climbed down out of our golden balconies and took our places with our brothers among the hosts of slumber. Upon our slumber, no doubt, there still breaks the occasional voice of a prophet who persists, who bids us arise and get ready for the battle, or flee from the wrath to come, or do anything indeed except acquiesce with a sleepy grunt in the despotism of disaster. It is to fight against disaster and destruction that we were born. Our prophets are those who put wakeful hearts in us for the conflict. There should perhaps be no prophet needed to belabor us unto making an end of such disasters as have recently taken place, in so far as they are preventable. Even our common sense, it might be thought, would be strong enough to insist upon the ordinary rules of caution being observed in ships and railways, and, though most of us are in little danger of dying in a pit explosion, even in coal mines. Sometimes, when I read the evidence of the cause of a railway disaster, and find a managing director or someone else in authority confessing, without repentance, that his committee for one reason or another ignored the recommendations made by the Board of Trade for the general safety, I marvel that the public never rise up and demand that a railway director shall be hanged. I have small belief in capital punishment, But if capital punishment must still be permitted in order to add a spice to the lives of newspaper readers, then I should confine it to railway directors and other magnates, who, though they never commit a murder privately for the delight of the thing, still run a system of murder far more sensational in results than any that was ever planned by French motor bandits. Think of all the railway accidents of recent times, the accidents of every day to the men on the line, and the accidents of red-letter days to us of the general public. There have been so many of these lately that even the most stupid devotees of private ownership are beginning to think that somebody must be responsible. And if somebody is responsible, then in a society which resorts to penal measures, somebody deserves punishment. It is ridiculous to send weak-minded women to jail for borrowing knickknacks off a shop counter, while you send strong-minded railway directors to Belgravia and Mayfair for maintaining a system of sudden death for workmen and travellers. In the days of the Irish famine, coroners' juries, whose business it was to report on the death of some starved man, used to bring in a verdict of wilful murder against Lord John Russell. Is there no coroner's jury of the present day to bring in an occasional verdict of wilful murder against the directors of a railway or a factory? When we see a railway manager sentenced to 7 years' penal servitude as the reasonable consequence of some disaster on the line, I have an idea that the number of railway accidents will diminish. When we see the directors of a shipping company fined a year's income, and the captain dismissed from his post for sending a ship full steam ahead through the fog, we shall be thrilled by fewer accidents at sea. But it is the old story. One's crime has only to be on a sufficiently grand scale to be as far above punishment as an act of God. What punishment can be too severe for a half-witted farmhand who burns his master's haystack? But as for the railway lords who burn a score of men, women, and children in the course of a railway smash by their carefully calculated carelessness, why, one might as well call down punishment on a thunderstorm. It pleases our indolent brains to regard accidents associated with dividends as the works of an inscrutable Providence. It is not enough that Providence should be the author, at least passively, of earthquakes and gales and tidal waves. He must also be held accountable for every breakage of bones that occurs as the result of our passion for saving money rather than life. Some day, I hope, the distinction between Providence and the capitalist will be a little clearer than it at present is. The confusion between the two has hitherto led to the capitalists being invested with a sacrosanctity to which we offer up human sacrifices on a scale far surpassing anything ever known in Peru or in the dark places of Africa. It would be folly, however, to prophesy a world from which disaster had disappeared on the heels of the mastodon. One can do little more than regulate disaster. We already regulate death by offering a strong discouragement to murder. Pessimists may contend that, in a world where so many deaths are taking place as it is, one or two more or less can hardly matter. But all the advances that the human race has ever made have only been an affair of one or two. The distribution of one or two women, of one or two privileges, of one or two pennies. Consequently, even in a world where disasters grow as thick as trees, we are bound to fight them so far as they can be fought. If we do not, the wilderness will swallow us. One is usually consoled by the leader writers, after a disaster has taken place, by the reflection that it has taught us certain lessons that will never, never be forgotten. Unfortunately, we know the lessons already. We do not want to be taught our ABC over again by having the alphabet burned into our flesh with a red-hot iron. At the same time, the leader writers do well in trying to arrive at some philosophy of disaster. But the true philosophy of disaster is one which will teach us to rage where raging will be of avail, and to endure where there is nothing for it but endurance. Most of us in these days are content to have no philosophy at all, philosophy being a name for serious thought about the universal disaster of death. To read Montaigne, who lived blithely in conversation with death, is to step right out of our modern civilization into a wiser world. It is to become an inhabitant of the universe instead of a rather inefficient earner of an income. Montaigne tells us that, even when he was in good health, if a thought occurred to him during a walk, he jotted it down at once for fear he might be dead before he could reach home and write it down at leisure. He made himself as familiar with death as he was with the sun or his neighbors. He explains what a happiness it would have been to him to write a history of the way in which different great men had died. And his essays are in great part an expression of interest in the caprices of death among the heroes of the human race. History was to him a procession of disasters, however, seen against a background of faith in the benevolence of the scheme of things, and he made his account with life as something to be enjoyed as a privilege rather than a right. "If a man could by any means avoid it," he said of death, "though by creeping under a calf's skin, I am one that should not be ashamed of the shift." Somehow, one hardly believes him. He seems here to be speaking for our reassurance, rather than historically. On the other hand, he is right 1,000 times in summoning even the most timid need to go out and shake hands with disaster as with a friend. To hide from it is only a kind of watered-down atheism. It is a distrust of life. It is easy, of course, to compose sentences on the subject. It is quite another thing to compose ourselves. Matthew Arnold relates in one of his prefaces how he once failed to bring any consolation to the occupants of a railway carriage at a time when a panic about murder in railway trains was running its course, by bidding them reflect that, even if any of them died suddenly by violent hands, the gravel walks of their villas would still be rolled, and there would still be a crowd at the corner of Fenchurch Street. It is a very rational mind that can get comfort out of a thought like that. Even when we are not troubled by thinking of our work or our family, we cannot but cry out against the corruption of this flesh of our bodies. And many of us quake at the thought of the enforced adventure of the soul into a secret world. Marked down for disaster, we may add to our income, or win a place in the cabinet, or make a reputation for singing comic songs, but death will steal upon us in our security, and strip us bare of everything save the courage we have learned from philosophy, and the faith that has been given us by religion. We spend our hours shirking that fact. Cowardice and pessimism will avail on our deathbeds no more than wealth or stuffed birds of paradise. Logically, then, every circumstance shouts to us to be brave. But alas, bravery, though in face of the disasters of others it is easy enough, in the face of our own disasters is a rare and splendid form of genius. To attain it is the crown of existence. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22. The Rights of Murder. Mr. Justice Darling, before passing a sentence of 7 years' penal servitude on Julia Decies for wounding her lover with intent to kill him, made a remark which must interest all students of the morals of murder. No one, probably, he declared, would very much lament the wounded man, but that was not the question. So far as one can gather from the scrappy reports in the newspapers, the crime was in the main a crime of jealousy. The man and woman had lived together for some years, had then separated, had come back to each other, and had finally quarreled as the result of a suggestion that he had taken up with some other woman with whom he was going to Paris. Incidentally, it was stated that the man had given Julia Decies £500 and some furniture in the previous October, on the understanding that she was to trouble him no further. It was also stated that the prosecutor had infected the woman with a terrible disease and that she was pregnant. There you have a story of contemporary life as mean in its horror as any that Gorky has written. It is a story in which the only conceivably beautiful element is the insurgent anger of the woman. It is a tragedy not of heroic suffering, but of the dull slums of human nature. Probably in any country where they managed things according to rough justice, instead of with judges and juries, no one would have blamed Julia Decies, even to the extent of a day's imprisonment, for seeking to avenge herself in the most extreme form on an environment so intolerable, on a man whom, in the judge's phrase, no one probably would very much lament. There is a mining camp logic which holds that if a man is not worth lamenting, one need not be greatly concerned whether he is alive or dead. Civilization, however, speaking from under the wig of Mr. Justice Darling, says of even the most worthless of its human products, he was a person whose life was entitled to the protection of the law as though he were a person with the best of characters. To the moralist of the mining camp, this would seem like saying that the weeds have as good a right to exist as the flowers. It is obviously one of the earliest instincts of man to get rid of his rivals by killing them. Cain was representative of the human race at this barbarous stage. It is the stage of unhampered egoism, of laissez-faire applied to morals. Poets, who sometimes inherit this egoism, have written sympathetically of Cain. Now that the art is becoming deliberately primitive again, we may expect to see new statues to Cain insolently set up in the poets' back bedrooms. Civilization is, in one aspect, a war against Cain and the minor poets. It depends in its early stages on the suppression of the private right to murder, on the socialization, one may say, of the right to kill. No doubt, even in the most highly developed civilizations, the right to kill is still left to some extent in the hands of private individuals. One has the right to kill certain people in self-defense. But the more advanced civilization is, the more limited will that right be. So limited has it become in modern England that it has been maintained one is not even entitled to shoot a burglar, unless, by running away, and in various other ways, one has first exhausted all the gentler devices for escaping injury at his hands. This may seem like a sad falling away from the dramatic virtues of the heroic age, when one slung dead burglars round one's neck like a bag of game. But the heroic age, as has been pointed out, was an age of egoists, not of citizens. When heroes evolved into citizens, as we see in the history of Athens, the culminating triumph came with the abandonment of the right to kill as symbolized in the carrying of arms. Athens was the first city in Greece in which the men went about unarmed. That was a recognition of the fact that civilized man is not a killing animal to the greatest degree possible, but only in the least degree possible. It may be retorted, on the other hand, that murder was not condoned in the case either of Cain or of Orestes, and there are many other examples of guilty murderers in the heroic age. This, however, only means that there was some limitation put upon the right to kill from the beginning. The right to kill did not exist as against the members of one's own family. It would have been impossible to explain the humor of the playboy of the Western world to men of the heroic age. The women who flocked with their farmhouse gifts to show their appreciation of the boy who had killed his father would have seemed long-nailed monsters of depravity to the Greeks of the time of Oedipus. Professor Freud, in his book on dreams, maintains that men in all ages desire to kill their fathers out of jealousy. He contends even that Hamlet's reluctance to kill his father's murderer was due to the fact that he had often wished to murder his father himself. This, however, is an abnormal interpretation of the jealousies and hatreds of human beings. The philosopher, perhaps, may see the principle of murder in every feeling of anger in the same way as the Christian apostles saw that, if you hate a man, you are already a murderer in your own heart. The hatred of parents and children, however, is not universal any more than the hatred of husbands and wives. Still, family quarrels are sufficiently natural to enable us to see that the first step toward good citizenship must have been the prohibition of the right to kill the members of one's own family. Gradually, the family widened into the clan into the city into the nation into the larger unit embracing men of the same color, and it will ultimately widen, one hopes, into the human race. But we are far from having reached that stage yet. It is said to be almost impossible to get a death sentence passed on an Englishman who has murdered an Indian native. This merely means that it is regarded as a lesser crime for a European to murder an Asiatic than for a European to murder a European. In other words, the family sanctities have been extended in some respects so as to cover Europe, but they have not yet overflowed so far as Asia and Africa. The objection of the war at any price party today to civil war is purely on the ground that it is fratricidal, that it is an outrage on recognized family sanctities. The militarists do not see that every war is fratricidal, that every war is a civil war. As a rule, indeed, they deny the existence of family rights outside the borders of their own nation in the narrowest sense. They do not realize that it is as horrible a thing to shoot fellow Europeans, not to say fellow men, as it is to shoot fellow countrymen. As private citizens, they not only admit, but insist upon the foreigner's right to live. As public-minded men and patriots, they will admit nothing beyond his right to be carried off on a stretcher if they fail to kill him on the field of battle. This, however, is to discuss Cain as a statesman rather than Cain as a human being, to consider the social right to kill rather than the individual right to kill. Public morals being so far in the rear of private morals, it raises an entirely different question from that suggested by Mr. Justice Darling's remark. Mr. Justice Darling laid it down that the private citizen has not, except, it may be presumed, in the last necessities of self-defense, the right to kill even the most worthless and treacherous of human beings. The spy, the sweater, the rack-renter, the ravisher, each has the right to trial by his peers. This, I believe, is good morals as well as good law. Even where it is a case of a blackguard's commission of some unspeakable crime for which there is no legal redress, though we may sympathize with his murderer, we cannot praise the murder. There are, it may be admitted, cases of murder with a high moral purpose. These are especially abundant in the annals of political assassination, which may be described as private murder for public reasons. Very few of us would claim to be the moral equals of Charlotte Corday, and we have abased ourselves for centuries before the at last suspected figures of Harmodius and Aristogeiton. There are crimes which are the crimes of saints. Our reverence for the saintliness leads us almost into a reverence for the crime. The hero of Finland a few years ago was a young man who slew a Russian tyrant at the expense of his own life. Deeds like this have the moral glow of self-sacrifice beyond one's own most daring attempts at virtue. How, then, is one to condemn them? But we condemn them by implication if we do not believe in imitating them. And few of us would believe in imitating them to the point of bringing up our children to be even the most honorable of assassins. One unconsciously analyzes these crimes into their elements, some of them noble, some of them the reverse. One has heard again of what may be called private murders for family reasons, crimes of revenge for some wrong done to a mother, a sister, or a child. Even here, however, one knows that it is against the interests of the state and of the race that we should admit the right to kill. Once allow crimes of indignation, and every indignant man will claim to be a law to himself. It may be that the prohibition of murder, even murder with the best of intentions, is in the interest of society rather than of any absolute code of morality. But even so, society must set up its own code of morality and self-defense. In practice, of course, It has also the right to distinguish between crimes that are the outcome of a criminal nature and crimes that are isolated accidents in the lives of otherwise good men and women. Lombroso was opposed to the severe punishment of crimes of passion, crimes which are not likely to be repeated by those who perpetrate them. This, however, is a plea for the consideration of mitigating circumstances, not an assertion that the crime of murder is in any circumstances justifiable. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23. The Humor of Hoaxes. It was only the other day that Mr. G. A. Birmingham gave us a play about a hoax at the expense of an Irish village, in course of which a statue was erected to an imaginary Irish-American general, the aide-de-camp of the Lord Lieutenant, coming down from Dublin to perform the unveiling ceremony. Lady Gregory, it may be remembered, had previously used a similar theme in The Image. And now comes the story of yet another statue hoax from Paris. On the whole, the Paris joke is the best of the three. It was a stroke of genius to invent a great educationist called Hégésippe Simon. One can hardly blame the members of the Chamber of Deputies for falling to the lure of a name like that. Perhaps they should have been warned by the motto which M. Paul Barrault of L'Éclair, the perpetrator of the hoax, quoted from among the sayings of the precursor, to whom he wished to erect a centenary statue. "The darkness vanishes when the sun rises," is an aphorism which is almost too good to be true. Monsieur Barrault, however, relying upon the innocence of human nature, sent a circular to a number of senators and deputies opposed to him in politics, announcing that, "thanks to the liberality of a generous donor, the disciples of Hégésippe Simon have been able to collect the funds necessary for the erection of a monument which will rescue the precursor's memory from oblivion," and inviting them to become honorary members of a committee to celebrate the event. Despite the fact that he quoted the sentence about the darkness and the sunrise, 30 of the politicians replied that they would be delighted to help in the centenary rejoicings. Monsieur Barrault thereupon published their names with the story of the hoax he had practiced on them, and as a result, according to the newspaper correspondents, all Paris has been laughing at the joke, "the good taste of which," adds one of them, "would hardly be relished in England, where other political manners obtain." With all respect to this patriotic journalist, I am afraid the love of hoaxing and practical joking cannot be limited to the Latin, or even to the continental races. It is a passion that is as universal as lying, and a good deal older than drinking. It is merely the instinct for lying indeed turned to comic account. Christianity, unable to suppress it entirely, had to come to terms with it, and as a result we have one day of the year, the 1st of April, devoted to the humours of this popular sin. There are many explanations of the origin of All Fools' Day, one of which is that it is a fragmentary memorial of the mock trial of Jesus, and another of which refers it to the belief that it was on the 1st of April that Noah sent out the dove from the ark. But the Christian or Hebrew origin of the festival appears to be unlikely in view of the fact that the Hindus have an All Fools' Day of their own, the Holi festival, on almost exactly the same date. One may take it that it was in origin simply a great natural holiday, on which men enjoyed the license of lying, as they enjoyed the license of drinking on a bank holiday. There is no other sport for which humanity would be more likely to desire the occasional sanction of church and state than the sport of making fools of our neighbors. We must have fools if we cannot have heroes. Some people who are enthusiasts for destruction, indeed, would give us fools and knaves in the place of our heroes, and have even an idea that they would be serving some moral end in doing so. It is on an iconoclastic eagerness of one kind or another that nearly all hoaxing and practical joking is based. It consists chiefly in taking somebody down a peg. The boy who used to shout "Woof!" however, may have been merely an excessively artistic youth who enjoyed watching the varied expressions on the faces of the sweating and disillusioned passers-by who ran to his assistance. Obviously, a man's face is a dozen times more interesting to look at when it is crimson with frustrate virtue than when it is placid with thoughts of the price of pigs. This is not to justify the morality of hoaxing. It is to explain it as an art for art's sake. Murder can, and has been, defended on the same grounds. It has to be feared, however, that few hoaxers or murderers can be named who pursued their hobby in the disinterested spirit of artists. In most cases there is some motive of cruelty or dislike. One would not go to the trouble of murdering and hoaxing people if it did not hurt or vex somebody or other. Those who invent hoaxes are first cousins of the boy who ties kettles or lighted torches to cats' tails. It is the terror of the cat that amuses him. If the cat purred as the instruments of torture were fitted on it, the boy would feel that he had serious cause for complaint. There is, no doubt, a great deal of the cruelty of boys, which is experimental rather than malicious, the practice of blowing up frogs, for instance. But, for most part, it must be admitted, a spice of cruelty is counted a gain in human amusements. This is called thoughtlessness in boys, but it is a deliberate enthusiasm in primitive man, out of which we have to be slowly civilized. There is probably no more popular game with the infancy of the streets than covering a brick with an old hat, in the hope that some glorious fool will come along who will kick hat and brick together, and go limping and swearing on his way. One might easily produce a host of similar instances of the humor of the small boy, who looks so like an angel and behaves so like a devil. There are, it may be, thousands of small boys who never perpetrated an act of such cheerful malice in their lives, but even they have usually some other outlet for their comic cruelty. The half of comic literature depends upon someone's getting cudgeled or ducked in a well or subjected to some pain. It is one of the paradoxes of comedy, indeed, that even when we like the hero of it, we also like to see him hurt and humiliated. We are glad when Don Quixote is beaten to a jelly, and when his teeth are knocked down his throat. We rejoice at every discomfort that befalls poor Parson Adams. Humor, even when it reaches the pitch of genius, has still about it much of the elemental cruelty of the boys who arranges a pin upon the point of which his friend may sit down, or who pulls away a chair and sends someone sprawling. Hoaxes, at the best, spring from a desire to harry one's neighbor. As a rule, refined men and women have by this time given up the ambition to cause others physical pain, but one still hears of milder annoyances being practiced with considerable spirit. It was Theodore Hook, I believe, who originated the practice of hoaxing tradesmen into delivering long caravans of goods at some house or other, to the fury of the householder and the disturbance of traffic. Every now and then the jest is still revived, whereupon everybody condemns it and laughs at it. That is one of the oddest facts about the hoax as a form of humor. No one has a good word to say for it, and yet everyone who tells the story of a hoax tells it with a chuckle. Some years ago, a young gentleman from one of the universities palmed himself off on an admiral, was it not, as the Sultan of Zanzibar, and was entertained as such by the officers on board one of King George's ships. Everybody frowned at the young gentleman's taste, but nobody outside the Navy failed to enjoy the hoax as the best item of the day's news. Similarly, the Copenhagen affair set not only all Germany but all Europe laughing. Skill and audacity always delight us for their own sakes. When it is rogueries that are skilful and audacious, they shock us into malicious appreciation. They are adventures standing on their heads. It is difficult not to forgive a clever impostor, so long as it is not we on whom he has imposed. As for the Hégésippe hoax, it may be that there is even an ethical element in our pleasure. Such a hoax as this is a pin stuck in pretentiousness. If it is an imposture, it is an imposture on impostors. One feels it is good that members of Parliament should be exposed from time to time. Otherwise they might be puffed up. Still, there remains a very good reason why we should oppose a disapproving front to hoaxes of all sorts. We ourselves may be the next victims. Most of us have a Hégésippe Simon in our cupboards. Whether in literature, history, or politics, the human animal is much given to pretending to knowledge that he does not possess. There are some men whom one could inveigle quite easily into a discussion on plays of Shakespeare and Euripides, which were never written. I remember how one evening two students concocted a poem beginning with the drivelling line, "I stood upon the rolling of the years," and foisted it on a noisy admirer of Keats as a work of the master. Similarly, in political arguments, one has known a man to invent sayings of Gladstone and Chamberlain without being challenged. This is, of course, not amusing in itself. It becomes amusing only when the other disputants, instead of confessing their ignorance, make a pretense of being acquainted with the invented quotations. It is our dread of appearing ignorant that leads us into the enactment of this kind of lies. We will go to any extreme rather than confess that we have never even heard of Hégésippe Simon. Luckily, Hégésippe Simon happens to be a person who can trip our pretentiousness up. But the senators and deputies who were willing to celebrate the precursor centenary were probably not humbugs to any greater degree than if they had consented to celebrate the anniversary of Diderot, or Rousseau, or Alfred de Musset. It is utter imposture, this practice of doing honor to great names, which mean less to one than a lump of sugar. And if an end could be put to centenary celebrations in all countries, no great harm would be done to public honesty. On the other hand, most public rejoicings over men of genius would be exceedingly small if all the speeches and applause had to come from the heart, without any addition from those who merely like to be in the latest movement. Perhaps the adherents of Hégésippe Simon are necessary in order to make it profitable to be a man of genius at all. They are not only a useful claque, but they pay. That is why even if William Shakespeare, Anatole France, and Bergson are only other and better known names for Hégésippe, it would be madness to destroy such enthusiasm as has gathered around them. Monsieur Burrell, by his light-hearted hoax on his political opponents, has struck at the very roots of popular homage to men of genius. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24. Anatole France. There does not at first glance seem to be any great similarity between Mr. Thomas Hardy and Monsieur Anatole France, the latter of whom has come to London to see how enthusiastically Englishmen can dine when they wish to express their feelings about literature. Yet both writers are extraordinarily alike. Each of them is an incarnation of the spirit of pity, of the spirit of irony. Mr. Hardy may have more pity than irony, and Anatole France may have more irony than pity. I might put it another way, and say that Mr. Hardy has the tragic spirit of pity, while Anatole France has the comic spirit of pity. But each of them is, in his own way, the last word of the 19th century on the universe, the century that extinguished the noon of faith and gave us the little star of pity to light up the darkness instead. Each of them is, therefore, a pessimist. Mr. Hardy, typically British; Anatole France, typically French, in his distress. It is as though Mr. Hardy spoke out of a rain cloud, Anatole France out of a cloud of irresponsible lightnings. There, perhaps, you have an eternal symbol of the difference between the Englishman, who takes his irreligion as seriously as his religion, and the Frenchman, who takes his irreligion as smilingly as his apéritif. It is just because he sums up the end of the 19th century so well that Anatole France is already in some quarters a declining fashion. He is the victim of a reaction against his century, not of a reaction against his style. He is the last of the true mockers. The 20th century demands that even its mockers shall be partisans of the coming race. Anatole France does not believe in the coming race. He is willing to join a society for bringing it into existence. He is even a socialist, but his vision of the world shows him no prospect of utopias. He is as sure as the writer of Ecclesiastes that every blessed or rather cursed, thing is going to happen over and over again. Life is mainly a procession of absurdities, in which lovers and theologians and philosophers and collectors of bric-a-brac are the most amusing figures. It is one of the happy paradoxes of human conduct that, in spite of this vision of futilities, Anatole France came forward at the Dreyfus crisis as a man of action, a man who believed that the procession of absurdities could be diverted into a juster road. Suddenly, as Brandes has said, he stripped himself of all his skepticism and stood forth with Voltaire's old blade gleaming in his hand, like Voltaire irresistible by reason of his wit, like him the terrible enemy of the Church, like him the champion of innocence. But taking a step in advance of Voltaire, France proclaimed himself the friend of the poor in the great political struggle. He even did his best to become a mob orator for his faith. Since that time he has given his name willingly to the cause of every oppressed class and nation. It is as though he had no hope and only an intermittent spark of faith, but his heart is full of charity. That somewhere or other a preacher lay hidden in Anatole France might have all along been suspected by observant readers of his works. He is a born fabulist. He drifts readily into fable in everything he writes, and if his fables do not always walk straight to their moral in their Sunday clothes, that is not because he is not a very earnest moralist at heart, but because his wit and humour continually entice him down bypaths. It is sometimes as though he set out to serve morality and ended up by telling an indecent story, as though he knelt down to pray and found himself addressing God in a series of blasphemies. This is the contradiction in his nature which makes him so ineffectual as a propagandist, so effectual as an artist. Ineffectual, one ought to say, perhaps, not as a propagandist, so much as a partisan. For he does propagate with the most infectious charm his view of the animal called man, and the need for being tender and not too serious in dealing with him. If he has not preached the brotherhood of man with the missionary fervour of the idealists, he has at least, in accordance with an idealism of his own, preached a brotherhood of the beasts. He never lets himself savagely loose upon his brother beasts as Swift does. Even in Penguin Island, with all its bitterness, he shakes his head rather than his stick at the vicious kennels of men. The truth is, Epicureanism is in his blood. If he could, he would watch the stream of circumstance as it went by with the appreciative indifference of the gods. It is only the preacher in his heart that prevents this. Like his own Abbé Coignard, he shares his loyalty between Epicurus and Christ. Henley once described Stevenson as something of the sensualist and something of the shorter catechist. Translated into French, that might serve as a character sketch of Anatole France. Originality has been denied to him in some quarters, but, it seems to me, unjustly. One may find something very like this or that aspect of him in Sterne or Voltaire or Heine. But in none of them does one find the complete Anatole France, ironist, fabulist, critic, theologian, artist, connoisseur, politician, philosopher, and creator of character. As artist, he is at many points comparable to Sterne. He has the same sentimental background to his wit, the same tenderness in his ridicule, the same incapacity for keeping his jests from scrambling about the very altar, the same almost Christian sensuality. Sterne, of course, is the more innocent writer, because his intellect was not nearly so covetous of experience. Sterne, though in his humanitarianism he occasionally stood in a pulpit above his time, was content for the most part to work as an artist. He could do all the preaching he wanted on Sundays. On weekdays, my Uncle Toby and Corporal Trim were the only minor prophets he troubled about. Anatole France, on the other hand, is not a preacher by trade. He has no safety valve of that kind for his moralizings. The consequence is that he has again and again felt himself compelled to ease his mind by adopting the part of the lay preacher we call the journalist. He is, in much of his work, a stern turned journalist, a stern, flashingly interested in leaving the world better than he found it, and other things that grieve the artistic. He might even be described as the greatest living journalist. The Bergeret series of novels are, apart from their artistic excellence, the most supremely delightful examples of modern European journalism. Similarly, when he turned for a too brief space to literary criticism, he proved himself the master of all living men in the art of the literary causerie. The 4-volume La Vie littéraire will, I imagine, survive all but a few of the literary essays of the 19th century. They are in a sense only trifles, but what irresistible trifles! But no criticism would be just which stopped short at the assertion that Anatole France is to some extent a journalist. So was Dickens, for that matter, and so, no doubt, was Shakespeare. It is much more important to emphasize the fact that Anatole France is an artist, that he stands at the head of the artists of Europe, indeed, since Tolstoy died. His novels are not the issue of an impartial love of form, like Flaubert's. They are as freakish as the author's personality. They tell only the most interrupted of stories. They might be said in many cases to introduce the Montaigne method into fiction. They are essays portraying a personality rather than novels on a conventional model. They may have a setting amid early Christianity or early medievalism. They may disguise themselves as realism or as fairy tales, but the secret passion of them all is the self-revelation of the author, the portraiture of the last of the mockers as he surveys this mouldy world of churches and courtesans. This portrait peeps round the corner at us in nearly every sentence. "Milesian romancers," cries M. Bergeret. "O shrewd Petronius! O Noël de Faye! O forerunners of Jean de La Fontaine! What apostle was wiser or better than you, who are commonly called good-for-nothing rascals? O benefactors of humanity, you have taught us the true science of life, the kindly scorn of the human race." There, by implication, you have the ideal portrait of Anatole France himself, the summary of his temper. The kindly scorn of the human race is the basis upon which the Francian Decalogue will be founded. In Penguin Island, the scorn at times ceases to be entirely kindly. It ceases even to be scorn. It becomes utter despair. But in Thais, in Sur la Pierre Blanche, in La Mannequin d'Osier, with what a comprehending sympathy he despises the human race! How amiably he impels the little creatures too, and lectures us on the humours of amorousness and quarrelsomeness and heroism in the insect world. Even the French Revolution he sees in Les Dieux ont soif as a scuffle of insects to be regarded with amusement rather than amazement by the philosopher among his cardboard toys. Not really amusement, of course, but pity disguised as amusement. The pity, too, not of a philosopher in a garden, but of a philosopher always curiously hesitating between the garden and the street. End of chapter 24.